This is Lecture English 385-26, Pronouns. All right, this lecture will run a bit longer, partially because it is weaving in the reading that I wanted you to look at after this lecture somewhat. It's a large chart with a bunch of pronouns on it that I'd like you to explore and examine, certainly not memorize, to discuss when we get back to class on Wednesday. Before I bring up that handout, I'd like to briefly touch on the topic of case. Case is something that is actually more intimidating to students of the history of the English language than it need be. And part of it is because students feel like it's introducing something so unfamiliar, when actually what it is it's introducing terms to describe something that is so hyper-familiar that it requires defamiliarization. Case refers to how we inflect pronouns to show how they are functioning grammatically in a given clause or sentence. So, we inflect the first person singular pronoun for case when we change it from I to me to my, right? If it's the subject in a sentence, I pet the dog, then we give it I. That is the nominative form. If it is the direct object of the sentence, the dog licks me, I am the object, the direct object of licks, then we make it me. In most varieties of English, though not all in the present day, we would neither accept me pets the dog, nor the dog licks I. In both cases, we need to inflect for case. When it's the subject, it's I. When it's the object, it's me. We also look at dative forms, right? So nominative is the subject, accusative is the direct object, dative is the indirect object. It's a little more complicated, particularly when we get to Old English. But we'll keep it simple here and say that when you are doing something to or for something else, right? You're doing something to something. Let me rephrase that. When you are taking action on a thing or on a person to or for another thing or another person, that other thing or other person is the indirect object. Let me give you some examples, right? I gave the dog to my daughter. The object, direct object of gave is the dog. The indirect object is my daughter. I said hello to your mom. Hello is the thing I said. It is the direct object. The indirect object is your mom. I said it to her, right? When we have something to or for, right, the prepositions to or for usually introduce an indirect object. For the purposes of present-day English pronouns, the differentiation between accusative and dative doesn't really matter, but in Old English we'll see that there is some differentiation between accusative and dative. We inflect them for case differently, depending on whether they are the direct or indirect object, which we need to do because sometimes there's no other clue to how they're functioning in the sentence, because syntax is more flexible as are prepositions. Finally, the fourth case is genitive. So we see nominative, the subject, accusative, the direct object, dative, the indirect object, genitive, the possessive. It's also the partitive, which we can talk about some in a later lecture. We'll return to this slide later, right? But let's leave it at that. The genitive is possessive. Let's run through examples. Let's ignore everything else on the slide for now. We'll get there, right? Let's just look at the pink writing here. So, nominative, I. Accusative or dative, me. Genitive, my or mine. We'll talk about that distinction in a moment. So, I pet the dog licks me. My daughter gave a dog to me. My daughter pet a dog for me. It is my dog. The dog is mine. Get it? We do that instinctually. We just haven't really thought about the words for it, probably. And that's true for native and EFL speakers alike. It's one of the first things any of us learn about English is how to inflect pronouns for case, right? She, her, and in this case, her or hers. He, him, his. They, them, theirs or their, right? What about the good old early modern thou? This is something that causes light bulbs for people. You would say thou pet the dog Actually, you probably say pettest, because we add an inflection to the verb in Middle English as well, and some early modern English, right? We say thou pettest the dog. The dog licketh thee. The difference between thou and thee is whether it is the subject or the direct or indirect object. I give the dog to thee. It is thy dog. The dog is thine. Genitive, right? All right. The distinction between you and thou, right, which are not as universally consistent as readings of Shakespeare's might suggest, is a difference not only in number, though number is the most common, but also in terms of formality, which I'll get to in a moment. But for the verb you, for the pronoun you, nominative is you, accusative and dative are you, and of course genitive, the possessive, is your or yours as it remains. What about relative pronouns? We'll be talking primarily about personal pronouns in this lecture, but let's talk about relative pronouns like who. Who pet the dog? Whom did the dog lick? The dog is doing the licking, and so we take the accusative form of who, which is whom. Same with dative. To whom am I speaking, I might ask. Right? Not to who. I've added a to, which probably means I'm speaking the dative. And of course, whose dog is this? That's the genitive. Who, whom, whose. Pretty straightforward. And finally, in one of many references I'll be making to Julian Talamantes-Berlaski's amazing poem that you read right before this, it in the nominative, it in the accusative, it in the dative, and in the genitive we get it's, often confused with a contraction for it is, but there's no apostrophe in the genitive it's. And this is notable. It's, as a genitive, is added as a change from above, as an appeal to logic, in the early modern English period. Middle English has no it's, nor does Old English. The genitive of it is simply his, which we'll talk about more in a moment. Pronouns. They remain and have always been the most inflected parts of the English language. They are inflected, as we've already begun to discuss, for person, case, gender, animacy or species, and number. Let's talk about those for a moment. Person, first person, second person, third person. So I, first person, second person, you, third person, they. Let's say case we've just covered. I, me, my, mine. Gender, he or she, or they, or perhaps something else. Animacy. This is the term that is conventionally used to differentiate referring to a person with pronouns like he, she, it. With pronouns like he, she, or they. And referring to an object, to an inanimate object, with pronouns like it. The brilliant thing about Julian Talamantes-Berlaski's poem is that the poem not only points out that animals inhabit this medium range where you refer to an animal as it as long as you're not sure what it is, but also the poet itself claims the inanimate pronoun for itself as a way of saying, no, if you're going to class me with a pronoun with someone, I'd rather be classed with Charlie the dog, at least in the state, before you know what it is. It's quite brilliant. And number, of course. Pronouns are generally inflected for number. It's the distinction between it and they, for instance, or between I and we. Though I can sometimes refer to myself as we, even now, if I am crowned, say, King of England, which I plan to be, but that's later. Okay, but anyway, I've got my plans. Anyway, right, if I were to become King of England, I might even now refer to myself with the plural we. We would call that the royal we, or the royal plural. Indeed, throughout the history of the English language, and even slightly to the present day, what register as pronouns inflected for number, sometimes what is the plural form of the generally first and second person pronouns, can also be inflected as though plural for moments of high formality or high social rank, whereas more familiar or more solidarity-driven examples will give you the singular more often. This is something that language studies more broadly calls the TV split, because in Spanish you get tú and vosotros, in French you get tu and vous. In each of these cases, you have generally a split between a second person singular and a second person plural, but sometimes that plural is used in situations of high formality or high social rank. That's why we call it a TV split. And in some early modern and certainly middle and old English, you have that same split between thou forms and ye or you forms. So the plural, what was then the plural you, would be used for highly formal people you're talking to in the second person. All right, so that's how we get to the handout. And the handout that I'll be showing you in the next few slides, many slides, is a handout that is broken down only personal pronouns. I won't be talking about relative pronouns or other pronouns here, just personal pronouns. Let's start with first person pronouns. And this is a lot of information. Of course it is, right? Pronouns have changed a lot over time. That's why I've given you this handout, to give you the full range, or at least some of the full range, of how personal pronouns have changed over time. I want to draw your attention to a couple of things that I say on the handout. Number one, in all years, number may vary not only because of actual number, that is the actual number of the subject objects, indirect objects, but also because of class, that is royalty, divinity, etc. That would be the royal we, the TV split. Also, interestingly, we see here the second line here, during the early modern English period, 1500 to 1800, the possessive case, let's treat possessive and genitive as interchangeable for the purposes of this lecture. They won't always be. The possessive case, the genitive case, splits decisively into possessive determiners and possessive pronouns, which are represented with a slash. So you see here under 1882, my versus mine. My is a possessive determiner. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it is modifying a noun rather than standing on its own as a replacement for a noun, as a pronoun does. So for instance, if I talk about this being the room that belongs to my daughter, I'm using it there as a possessive determiner onto daughter. It hasn't replaced daughter. In some situations, if you asked, oh, which one of those is your daughter? I'd say, oh, that one is mine. In that case, I have replaced daughter with a pronoun, mine, and it is a possessive pronoun. In this case, then, I've separated out possessive determiners and possessive pronouns, which do tend to change together. The important thing is that until the present-day English period, until roughly 1800, mine daughter, mine uncle, thine daughter, thine uncle, would still be acceptable, right? So we only get a strong distinction between those two really in the present-day English period, as far as I understand it. The distinction develops across the early modern period, right? So it begins to develop in 1500 and it becomes set in the precise way that it is now, where I can no longer say, oh, this is Cleo, she's mine daughter. I would have to say my daughter, only really consistently in the present-day English period. All right. Speaking of dates, you'll see here I've organized things by 1012, 1412, 1582, 1882, and 2012. The reason for this is because I was being cheeky when I first made this handout, and it was the year 2012. This handout is 9 years old. It's been through a few iterations, but it still retains that form. And so I took the year that I was writing it in, and I just went back in time. Rather than give then ranges of dates, which are always misleading, I simply am asking in this handout, how would I say it in this year? How would I say it in this year? This year, this year, this year. So these years are not at all cutoff dates by any means. And you'll see here I've organized all of my pronouns by person, number, case, gender, and species. So let's take a look at the first person singular nominative. If we look here at the first person singular nominative, that's the, I'll just move it to the slide a little bit so I can point. The first person singular nominative, we see that the Old English version of I was each, right? And we'll remember in Old English, some C's, the letter C, is a ch or k sound, right? In 1412, right, again in the Middle English period, we have each, but also the emergence of variants on that. E, which can be spelled I or Y. Sometimes you'll see each spelled YCH even, right? We'll remember in Dame Seereth, the each form is still holding on, but it has fallen out of use once we get into the early modern period. We pretty much only have I in most varieties in the early modern period. Some Scots may beg to differ. and then so on. Of course, the pronunciation of this word will vary from ich to ich, e, and then in the early modern period, we probably have something more like e, and then I, right? But we'll know that from our vowel chart. What about the first person plural right here, right? First person plural nominative is we. And we'll see here that the first person plural nominative remains pretty consistent. The pronunciation is going to change from we to we, but it's the same, right? First person plural nominative. Same roughly with the first person plural accusative. Us, 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 right? Though notably here, this is a distinction between accusative and dative. Old English, you'll see in this column, Old English allows a variant usich for the first person plural accusative when it's the direct object, but not generally for the dative when it's an indirect object. Aha. And so too, we see something similar happening with the possessive, the first person plural possessive. We see, let's go from the present back, our, ur, user. There you go, right? Notably, again, remember that these plural forms can also be used in high formality situations to refer to a single person. All right. Oh, wait a minute. What's all this in the middle? I'm going to preface this by saying this is my favorite part, maybe, of the class. This is the coolest thing, maybe, about the history of the English language. Are you ready? Here we go. In between the singular and plural inflections, only in Old English, right? It falls out by the time of Middle English, right? Certainly by 1412. We have a number inflection between singular and plural. If it's just me speaking, if it is just I speaking, I should say. If it's just I would say, I pet the dog. If it's all of us, our whole class, I'd say, we pet the dog. But what if it's just two of us? I'd say, we't pet the dog. There's a separate class of pronouns, first and second person pronouns, for just two, right? Instead of giving it to us, if it is two of us, it's not us, but it's unk, or unch, or unchit, right? It's ours if it is more than two of us, but if it's just two of us, it might be uncher. Get it? Wit, unch, uncher. It's brilliant. It's something that I wish we hadn't lost. It's an amazing, and if you want a testament to how pronouns are continually changing, that's one. We have lost from Old English an entire numerical, an entire number, there it is, an entire number, right? It didn't used to just be singular and plural. We used to have the ability to refer to singular, dual, and plural. That's the dual number. All right. Moving on to second person pronouns. You'll see here it breaks down in similar ways. Now, some people are intimidated at first by the, some people are intimidated at first by the Old English form of the second person singular nominative, but it's really just that thorn, which is consistently used in, oops, sorry about this. What the heck? It's the thorn that's consistently used in Old English. Get down there, slide. Thu, which is thou, right? So we know that thorn means th, thu, second person singular nominative, thou. Thou and you become interchangeable. Already in Shakespeare's time, they are somewhat interchangeable, and not only because of formality. Again, we're talking about singular here, but there is more of a flexibility in how you is applied to singular subjects than I think textbooks let us believe. Shakespeare uses them very precisely in his sonnets, that's for sure, but it's not always so simple. But anyway, thou and you are in play in the early modern period for singular subjects. I'd say that actually I would amend this to say thou and you are in play for singular subjects somewhat in the Middle English period as well. But then by the present day English period, it's just you, and thou has fallen out of usage except in purposefully archaic forms. We see here again the difference between thou and thee is the difference between nominative and accusative or dative, and then of course the possessive, and the distinction between your and yours again emerges in the present day English period. In 1582 and in the early modern period, you could still have thy or thine or your somewhat interchangeably. All right, and we have the dual for second person as well, where we had wheat before, now we have yit. Yit. We have yit, inch, incher for just the two of you, right? Imagine that for, like, say, a wedding. All right. And then second person plural, we get the forms ye, yeo, ewer, which becomes ye, you, your. Notice here in the handout that I have acknowledged that in the present day English period, after we have the early modern English period begin to flatten the distinction between thou and you to the degree that that thou falls out of usage, present day Englishes begin to push for some way to distinguish, just naturally, to distinguish between second person singular and second person plural, which we don't have in any standard Englishes right now. So we develop things like y'all, yins, yous, etc. And y'all is in play as early as the 19th century. Another point that I want to draw your attention to on the handout, you see here I say, again, after the year 1100, the accusative and dative case can both refer to objects in general. So the distinction between inflections for direct and indirect objects falls out in terms of inflection after the year 1100, after the Old English period. All right, there we are. We've done first person and second person, and hopefully through those relatively easy cases, I don't mean cases, I mean examples, we can introduce the handout and give you a sense of what the dual was, what the royal plural or the formal plural was, etc., and what the cases mean. And now we get into the meat of the lecture. And again, as I warned, this lecture is a bit longer in form. Third person pronouns, which Julian Talamantes-Berlasky has already gotten us thinking about in a pretty deep way. I'll start with a quote from it. It says, and this is the top quote, and then I'm like, well, maybe I can expect people to use that is the it pronoun, because it's so weird. People have told me that it makes them uncomfortable, that it's like they feel like they might be dehumanizing me. And I was like, exactly. Think about what is revolutionary going on in Julian Talamantes-Berlasky's choice of an it pronoun for itself. Faced with what it calls the pronoun circle jerk, where everyone has to identify with one or the other or another pronoun, it says it would rather identify with Charlie, the dog, and the sky. And it notes also that the question of animacy in a pronoun, whether to refer to it as it or as a dog, say, as him or her, is about whether you yet know what it is. You call a bird or a dog it when you don't yet know what it is. It's a very thought-provoking distinction, and it messes with one of the sort of taken for granted distinctions at the base of grammatical and gender in general in terms of pronoun, the idea that animacy, the very being human, counting as a human pronoun, means having to gender your pronoun in some way. Talamantes-Berlasky is rejecting that and saying, you're dehumanizing me? Good. Exactly. It's a powerful choice to make. I'm going to draw this into connection with something that's going on with a different Julian. This is Julian Talamantes-Berlasky, and this is a quotation from the editor of the Teams edition of the work of Julian of Norwich. I'll just read it to you. This is not about, well, it is a bit of pronouns. In chapters, so this is about the work of Julian of Norwich, who is a 14th century writer, a woman. In chapters 57 to 58, the scribe, 57 to 68, I told you I was nervous about Roman numerals. I'm going to say that again, and I'm not going to do take 9 of this lecture. I'm going to say, sorry, I misread. It's 57 to 63. In chapters 57 to 63, the scribe of manuscript S1 frequently but not always capitalizes the words mother and motherhood. This visual effect in reading the manuscript is quite striking in that the pronouns, masculine pronouns for God, are not capitalized. Some of the effect is muted in the present edition in that I have followed the policy of the Middle English text series and thus capitalized the personal pronouns and titles for God, but I have followed the manuscript's capitalization, this is again the modern editor of a 14th century text, of mother and motherhood in these chapters, given the possibility that the practice might reflect scribal intention or perhaps even the authority of Julian herself. Now this is thought-provoking. because Julian in her writing talks about how God and the divine is beyond gender, and in fact is dual gendered. God is as often in Julian referred to as a father or a son as a mother. And so while Julian uses he, him pronouns consistently to refer to that God, Julian also, this is Julian of Norwich, not Julian Talamantes-Berlaski, Julian of Norwich also considers as a given that divine gender would be fluid. It just doesn't mess with the pronouns, though it does mess with capitalization in ways we might not expect. Let's dig into third-person pronouns historically with that in mind. We'll start with this category. I'm going to separate these out, right? So we now have person, number, case, gender, and species. And we have third-person singular, nominative, feminine, human, which we get here. I'm actually going to move it here. Which we get here in Old English, we have many forms. Heo, hie, he, hio. Middle English takes that to heo. We get the development of she, ho, sometimes he, notice that's interchangeable with the masculine, and ho, or sorry, that would be hyo, hyo, there we go, hyo, that's the yog, and at the beginning of words, yog has a y. Early modern, she, sort of clamps down on that variation and stays that way. So too with other forms, though importantly, and this is something I actually do want you to have in memory, notice that the accusative and dative and possessive forms of the third person singular feminine human are going to be very similar to the plural of the same, right? So hira is what becomes her or hers is very similar to what will become their. So those two in spelling and possibly in pronunciation are essentially identical and interchangeable, right? What about masculine? Oh, sorry. And here we have also an important category. Actually, no, I'll jump down here. Masculine human pronouns. The same variation is not witnessed in these. Pretty consistently, he in 1012 remains he in 1412. In 1582, we get sometimes, and actually this happens in the earlier forms too, we sometimes get he reduced to a, as Shakespeare's Hamlet does, right? But then it remains he pretty consistently, he to he. Here we have a pretty remarkable distinction between accusative and dative. If it's the direct object, an accusative masculine human subject is hina, and it's only him in the dative. It normalizes to him pretty quickly. All right, and then we get his consistently across. But here's something I want to introduce as well. I want to introduce the possibility, as a sort of mirror image of Talamantes-Berlaski's poem, the possibility of a non-human feminine or non-human masculine pronoun. What? How can an object have gender? It most certainly can. Let's look at how. For one thing, all nouns have grammatical gender attached to them in Middle English. This is just as true of present-day Spanish, right? Libro is a book in Spanish. It's liber in Latin. Both of those are masculine pronouns. Masculine nouns, and so have a masculine pronoun, say lo, to replace them, right? Here we have certain nouns are feminine nouns. Let's say ship, right? S-C-I-P in Old English. If you're using a pronoun to represent a ship, you would use identical pronouns to the pronouns you would use for a female human, right? They're feminine non-human pronouns, and they're the same. And you see here the same thing with masculine. If you're referring to a masculine object, it's the same, right? Masculine, non-human. This is what we call grammatical rather than natural gender. It's not in the nature of the thing, it's just the grammatical category. And that remains in place, actually, for a long time. Actually, as late as the 19th century, you could refer to a country or a ship as she or her. And you wouldn't be just being sort of poetic. You would actually be using a sort of age-old grammatical construction. It is only really in the present day that we have completely dropped, except in very old-sounding, super formal or archaic-sounding poetry. We have dropped any possibility that we can refer to an object with a gendered pronoun. All right. This is what Julian of Norwich has to say when we read some more. I'll read the quote. I'll read it in Middle English, and hopefully you can follow along. Jesus Christ, that doeth good again evil, is our very mother. Jesus Christ is our mother. We have our being of him where the ground of motherhood beginneth. And notice here, by the way, you will remember that the him is capitalized only by the modern editor. Excuse me. We have our being of him where the ground of motherhood beginneth, with all the sweet keeping of love that endlessly followeth. She continues, second paragraph. As verily as God is our Father, as verily God is our mother. And that showed he in all, and namely in these sweet words where he saith, I it am. I am it. That is to say, I am it am, the might and the goodness of the fatherhood. I it am the wisdom of the motherhood. I it am the light and the grace that is all blessed love. I it am the Trinity. I it am the unity. I am the sovereign goodness of all manner of things. Now let's pause here for a second. There's something similar going on here to what Julian Talamantes Berlaski is talking about. The idea that being classed as human and thus needing a gender to attach to you is something that can be transcended, and maybe should be. All right. And here you'll notice that as much as the editor has said that Julian, that is Julian of Norwich, the writer, uses third person masculine pronouns to refer to God, here God, in many ways, is referring to itself with an it pronoun. The mother may give her child to suck her milk, but our precious mother Jesus, he may feed us with himself, and does so full courteously and full tenderly with the blessed sacrament that is the precious food of very life. Thus, he is our mother in kinde, remember that word from Dinshaw, by the working of grace in the lower part for love of the higher part, and he wills that we know it. Also, if you're interested, I want to point out, in English 330, we talk about the play of wisdom, in which also the gender of God is considered, the gender of God and the gender of the wisdom of God in all people is considered fluid in gender. My point is that the idea of gender fluidity is not as novel a concept as it may seem. It was a concept that seems to have been restricted, at least in pronouns, in the early modern to early present day period. But actually we see a remarkable amount of play, conceivable and speakable, in the pre-modern period. And so, let's take a look at third person plural pronouns. Sorry about this. Third person plural pronouns. Right? As I mentioned, the third person masculine non-human pronouns are identical to the human pronouns. But what's notable is that masculine pronouns too can refer to objects. Notably, here in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, "When that April with his showers sote," right? When that April with his sweet showers. Here we seem to be making April masculine, his. But the trick is actually that, here we go, where is it? Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, yeah, sorry. This is the third person nominative, non-gendered, non-human. It. There we go, sorry for that blip there. Right, so the pronoun it, as I mentioned earlier, the possessive form of that pronoun also is his, well into the early modern period. We only get the development of its, sometimes indeed with the apostrophe, in the 1500s. So when Chaucer says "When that April with his showers sote," he may be considering April a gendered masculine noun. He may be personifying April as a man, or he may simply be using the possessive form of it, which is his. Or it could be anywhere between those. The point is the language and pronouns that Chaucer had to work with are significantly more fluid in meaning than what we have now. And let's look at finally third person plural, which I think I said I was going to do, but I forgot about the non-human version. Okay. Third person plural, nominative, accusative, dative, and possessive. Hie, him, hiere. Okay, that's Old English, with variation widely. And then here, importantly, right, we'll remember that the third person plural can be them, right? They, them, right? Ham, heom, them, right? These forms are very variable, particularly according to region, right? So we have hie, hem, here in the south, but we have they forms, them, there, in, say, the north and elsewhere. That only gets normalized, as we'll remember, after chancery with they, them, there. I want to zoom in on something here. This is what I have in the space for the nominative. I've just quoted the Middle English Dictionary here, right? This is all of the variations on they that the Middle English period gives us. They, thigh, they, a, yay, they, te, day, they, tha, they, yay. Whew. Right? And hie is still there as well. These variants are included to show the breadth of variance for all Middle English pronouns, not just this one. Old Norse borrowing make the third person plural pronouns especially variant. Oops, oh geez, sorry. That's why we get so much variation because of Norse influence in these plural third person pronouns. They then normalize to they, them, their, only after chancery, their and theirs, right? Okay. Whew. So where to from there? What about this category, third person singular, non-gendered, but human? Well, as we are all well aware, that is a question that is currently under quite a bit of debate. And I refer you here to the work of Dennis Barron, whose work has expanded on this over the past, I think, 2 decades. The creation and use, this is the top left corner, the creation and use of gender-neutral human pronouns. That is, a pronoun to refer to a human being that is gender-neutral, but, as Julian Talamatis-Brolaski would remind us, that is also animate, right? We've always had a gender-neutral pronoun, singular pronoun, in it. But here is the search for a gender-neutral human singular pronoun. And the work of Dennis Barron reminds us that the creation and use of gender-neutral human pronouns as a change from above, that is, someone saying, as they might with y'all, someone saying, we don't have one, we should have one, let's make one, is attested as early as 1841, with, he quotes with the ESM, which is similar to, those of you who know computer science, Spivak pronouns in certain computer languages. This is contemporary with women's rights and suffrage movements, but are often presented as appeals to logic. So circa 1850, and indeed as early as 1841, we have a series of, which I quote at more length in the handout, and this is all taken almost directly from Dennis Barron, a series of attempts to change from above and develop a non-gendered, a gender-neutral human pronoun. So this is, again, not a new conversation. All right, and actually I'll quote here John Stuart Mill, or I'll refer to John Stuart Mill, who sought grammatical equality for women. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wanted a pronoun that would not specify gender. These goals, separately and together, spurred 19th century word coiners in their quest for the missing word. In 1852, an anonymous writer complained that the generic he refers only to men. Coordinate he or she is inelegant and bundling, right, saying if he or she should wish to, and singular they would violate grammatical rules. To remedy this, the writer called on one of our grammar makers to craft a new pronoun. This is not a new conversation. This is a conversation that goes back a long time, and that, my friends, is only for changes from above. But pronouns change naturally from below. And in fact, the non-gendered singular human pronoun has actually been in play since well before the PDE period. Let's keep looking. They as a pronoun, right, as a singular, has been in use since early Scandinavian. Let me rephrase that. Has been in use since, please review and rewind that, has been in use since, wrong slide, has been in use since ante 1450. That is, with an antecedent referring to an individual generically or indefinitely, as in someone, a person, the student, used especially so as to make a general reference to such an individual without specifying gender. This is the singular they, right? So here we have, if thou shalt love the person first, y read thou prove whether that they be false or true. If you shall love the person first, I advise you should prove whether they be false or true. That is, my friends, referring to a person, a singular person, with a they, before 1450. It's naturally what happens grammatically when we're talking about a person in general who can be any gender grammatically. 1526, if a psalm escape any person or a lesson, or else yet they omit one verse or twain, etc., etc., and so on, right? This is common usage and indeed instinctual usage. As a change from below, we have, at least in certain contexts, that is with an antecedent referring to an individual generically, such as someone, a person, etc. When we say antecedent, we mean the thing that a pronoun is always a replacement, right? A pronoun is a replacement for a proper noun. If the proper noun, that antecedent, is a generic individual, like someone or a person, then we use that non-gendered they pretty commonly. And you'll see they comes to us, this is the thing I meant to refer to before, from early Scandinavian. So this comes from Old Icelandic, etc. This is the invasion of the Norse form. So we're using the non-gendered they before 1450 in certain contexts. And indeed, if we look at the Middle English Dictionary, we see here references even earlier. That was from the OED, but this is a use of the with a singular antecedent, right? Version E is with a singular antecedent, right? The pronoun, the thing the pronoun refers to or replaces the antecedent. Here we have, before 1375, Erich Gom of Grace, every man of Greece, or sorry, every person of Greece, better to say. No, that's man. Gom means man, sorry. Goma, every Goma of Grace, when they wedded a wife. Right? So here we are using they to refer to a man. It's fluid. Right? Even more so in, again, ante 1375 here, Goma generally means man, but here, hastily hied eche wicht, hastily rushed every person, till they nähert so nigh, till they drew so close, etc., etc. That is Middle English usages, my friend. And again, the etymology is Old Norse of this. So, since in Old English inanimate objects were called he or she, right? We have the feminine and masculine non-human objects. While you have the word wife, right? The word wife was actually a neuter noun. So if you were to replace the word wife with a pronoun, you might get a non-gendered, non-human pronoun. It's very confusing. The fact is, one wonders whether a gender-neutral human pronoun would even be necessary. This is me talking about the fact that Julian of Norwich seems to be referring to God as fluid in gender. Quite literally, we quoted her as saying as much. God as fluid in gender, but uses consistent he, him pronouns to refer to God. Well, him and his actually could also be it pronouns. And the fact is, given that in Old English and well into Middle English, inanimate objects could be called he or she, one wonders whether a gender-neutral human pronoun would even be necessary. Perhaps it is only made necessary when grammatical gender begins to fade from English. In other words, the past may be more fluid in its approach to pronouns than it seems.